The garden of serenity unfolded beneath a sky of perpetual dusk, its half-light poised between day and night, a breath held between waking and dream. The ether, thick with the hush of unseen murmurs, carried the scent of loam and moon-kissed blossoms, their fragrance entwining with the land's slow, steady pulse. Light did not merely touch the flora, it bloomed within it, exhaling through silver-green veins and vines spun from moonlit silk. The evening breeze stirred them into motion, a quiet symphony of rustling silks and murmured reveries. Above the treetops, 2 moons lingered, silent sentinels, their glow dusting the realm in the shimmer of a dream half-remembered. At the heart of this sanctuary, Kalen knelt before a cluster of lilies, their luminously veiled petals trembling in the hush. His skin, dark and smooth as polished obsidian, drank the garden's quiet glow. Along his forearms, faint markings shimmered, shifting in tandem with some unseen rhythm, as if attuned to the pulse of the realm itself. He cupped a single blossom in his palms. Its glow rose like an exhale, as if it, too, recognized him, a heartbeat, a benediction, an echo of something older than words. For a moment, he closed his eyes in silent devotion, listening to the realm's secret language. A whisper of movement traced his spine, a sensation both familiar and beyond him. The shift was slight, like the ghost of a second pulse threading through him, attuned to the unspoken rhythms of the garden. It stirred with the tremor of unseen currents, its awareness laced seamlessly into his own, sharpening the cool press of soil beneath his knees, the quiver of a leaf before the wind reached it. No thought guided it, no command was needed. It slipped through him like an unspoken vow, as natural as the tide's return. A tremor sighed through him, faint, almost imagined, a whisper beneath his knees. The unseen wakened. The lilies in his palm pulsed gently, their glow rising and dimming in time with a rhythm deeper than thought. Somewhere within, his symbiote, half his own body, half something older, stirred in silent accord, warmth pooling beneath his fingertips, the soil exhaling a thread of hidden heat. A leaf, still as breath held too long, shivered a fraction before the breeze arrived. Somewhere in the distance, water swelled and stilled, a ripple swallowed before it could break the hush. His hands moved with quiet reverence, fingertips grazing each petal as if listening for something only they could hear. At the garden's edge, a reflective pool murmured beneath the twin moons, their glow stretching in a ribbon of silver across its surface, liquid light dissolving into water. This place brimmed with an untouched purity, an essence his body understood without thought, an instinct woven into him, guiding him to sift the unseen, to drink light like sustenance, to still himself within the trembling world. Nothing in him recoiled, nothing resisted, only a quiet equilibrium, fluid as a river's drift. He rose without haste, the rhythm of the garden guiding him forward. Under the canopy of shimmering vines, Kalen moved to a low stone altar near a crystal-clear stream. Dawnless night enveloped the garden, though darkness here was never absolute. Tiny motes of living light drifted among the leaves, and the gentle burble of water wove with the soft chorus of plant life humming in unison. He knelt at the stream's edge, cupping cool water in his palms, watching as it caught the pale glow of the twin moons. Droplets slipped through his fingers, cascading back into the current with a sound like the softest chime. He raised the remaining water to his lips, pressing his forehead briefly to the surface before releasing it. He grew still, his hands, still damp, rested lightly on the stone, tracing the fine cracks where roots had gently pried their way through over time. "You are heard," he murmured, his voice scarcely louder than the mist drifting over the water. He closed his eyes, letting the world move within the hush of existence, weaving through him, the cool whisper of the stream against his skin, the crisp scent of damp earth, the hush of leaves bending toward him. You are seen. A silver-dusted moth flitted past his shoulder, settling upon his outstretched palm, and you are loved. The words dissolved into the murmuring water, drifting on ripples threading through the garden's veins, their whispers vanishing into the current. His fingers lingered in slow circles against the stone before he rose, the moth lifting away as if released from a silent vow. By the time his ritual was complete, the ether had softened, as though the garden itself had paused to listen. Yet even here, where life thrived in the silver hush of moonlight, Kaelin felt the restless undercurrent, the quiet unraveling at the edges of existence. Even here, beneath the twin moon's watchful gaze, time wove its slow dissolution, soft as drifting gauze, quiet as the hush between heartbeats, a whisper dissolving into a current slipping beyond memory's reach. The moonlight brushed the lilies. Their glow swelled where his fingers had traced them, as if holding the imprint of his presence. A ripple moved through the stream, catching the reflection of the moons before dissolving into the currents. He watched in silence, the water carrying away something unspoken, a hush woven with echoes of all that had passed. Somewhere in the canopy a night bird called, its voice threading through the stillness. A breeze wove through the vines, stirring them in slow, reverent motion. The lilies pulsed once more. Kaelin turned, stepping into the living embrace, his feet touching the path of light. In the early glow of the garden's perpetual twilight, Liara stepped to the lake's edge, where the cosmos lay mirrored in glassy stillness. As she stepped onto a mossy embankment, the soft crunch of her bare feet blended with the distant trill of nocturnal birds. Her form, sculpted by deeper melanin and lithe muscle, bore the lineage of lands where the sun burned fierce, where winds carried whispers of endurance. Yet she moved as a willow bends to the wind's quiet call. Kaelin waited there, cross-legged upon a bed of soft moss. Their eyes met, no words needed, only the quiet language of shared years, a subtle tilt of Liara's head, a faint smile curving her lips. In that single gesture, Kaelin saw not just a companion, but the echo of every shared morning, seasons spent guiding fragile shoots toward the sun, moments stolen in the embrace of ancient roots, whispered recollections of a realm that faded like mist at dawn. They began their caretaking together. Liara plucked wilted petals from a giant blossom whose fragrance wove vanilla and frankincense into the air. Kaelin gathered the fallen petals into a palm-sized pouch, humming a gentle tune. When Liara lifted her hand to shield a delicate bud from a cold draft, Kaelin knelt beside her, pressing nutrient-rich soil around the stem. Their movements wove together like entwined vines, each gesture met with its unspoken counterpart, as though they had long since learned the cadence of each other's hands. At times, Liara's laughter rippled across the lake. Kaelin, elbow resting on his knee, let a playful grin curve his lips. "You really think they'll call us by name someday?" he mused, cupping a half-wilted blossom and tracing its bright veins. "We could name this one after your morning giggle." Liara's eyes flickered with amusement. "You jest, but you know every creature here holds a memory." She smoothed the petals of a newly unfurled bloom, her voice turning reverent. "In naming them, we become part of that memory. Someday, I'd like them to remember that we tended to them with the same devotion the wind gives the trees, the river to the valley." Kaelin chuckled softly and set the blossom down with care. The thought warmed him that in this place, Even the smallest petal might carry the imprint of their presence, the silent testament of hands that nurtured without expectation. Yet something flickered in Liara's gaze whenever she looked toward the horizon, a quiet melancholy, there and gone. She lingered, watching the swirling mists that marked the boundary between the garden and a world long scarred by collapse. Kalen noticed, but hesitated to break the moment. Instead, he brushed his thumb gently across her wrist, an unspoken gesture that he was there, always. Liara stepped closer to the lake, moonlit water fractured beneath her presence, unfurling a vision beyond the garden's borders. Through shifting reflections, another realm bled through, jagged rock formations where forests had stood, dust-laden plains beneath an unforgiving sun, roiling clouds thick with poisoned haze. In the far distance, a superstorm churned, a colossal funnel devouring a landscape of fragmented stone. A single fork of lightning speared the cracked earth, illuminating the barest outline of wind-sculpted dunes stretching into dust. Liara stilled, and the air around them grew unnaturally quiet. "It's worse today," she murmured, her voice laced with quiet sorrow. That storm could consume everything in its path. Kalen rose, resolve settling into his stance. "Then let us offer what balance we can." They knelt side by side at the lake's edge, fingertips grazing the water's surface in a shared ritual. Their symbiotes stirred along their spines, amplifying the subtle energies they channeled. As their eyes closed, a current of faint luminescence flowed outward, merging with the storm's reflection. Their heartbeats aligned with the muted rasp of leaves, the glow of blossoms, the distant hum of hidden life. For a moment, the mirrored vision wavered. The superstorm's howling form rippled, its edges softening as if hesitating. Its winds pressed onward, yet something within its depths shimmered, an opalescent flicker of stillness threading through its fury. They did not fight the storm. Instead, they wove stillness into its rage, a single thread stitched into the fabric of chaos. When their vigil ended, the lake's surface smoothed, its vision fading. Though the scarred realm remained harsh and wounded, they had sewn a single thread of quiet cadence into its unraveling tapestry. Liara lifted her gaze from the lake, watching the last traces of shimmer dissolve. In her eyes rested both sorrow and resolve, as if she alone cradled the wounded expanse in her sight. "We'll look again tomorrow." Kalen nodded, tucking a fresh blossom into her hand. In their shared glance was an understanding that their quiet labor was a hymn only the spirits could hear. They rose, their steps unhurried, as they walked side by side. When they reached the grand archway of woven vines, they paused. The blossoms that once pulsed with living light now held only a faint shimmer, as if dusk had settled within their petals. The scent of jasmine still lingered, but fainter now, carrying something fragile, almost hesitant. Liara knelt before a cluster of orchids nestled at the arch's base. She reached out, fingers brushing over the petals. A tremor passed through them, subtle, retreating. Kalen watched as her touch lingered, her brows drawing together in quiet concern. "Let me sing to them," she whispered. Kalen nodded, his expression a quiet benediction. Liara let the silence settle first, fingertips grazing the petals as if listening. Then, in a low murmur, she wove an ancient melody, a lullaby for wilting things. The orchids stirred, a shiver through their stems, a faint glimmer teasing the edges of their petals. But the glow faltered, flickered, and finally extinguished. The song trailed into silence. Liara lowered her hands, grief tightening her throat. Kalen's fingers traced slow, reassuring circles against her shoulder. "It's all right," he murmured. "We'll try again." Liara's shoulders eased. She nodded. They rose together, their steps unhurried, as they walked side by side, tracing familiar paths through the dimming glow of the foliage. A tremor pulsed beneath them, a ripple at the threshold of knowing. Something stirred in the roots, a presence just beyond reach. Liara's voice was scarcely more than breath. "It's waiting." At the cusp of nightfall, shadows stretched long, the last threads of sunlight weaving gold through rippling waters. Dusk thickened, rich with the trill of unseen creatures, the sway of tendrils reaching for the darkening expanse. Liara and Kaelin rested side by side on a polished ledge of warm stone, their stillness a language of its own. Without thought, Liara's head found its place against Kaelin's shoulder. Neither spoke, their pulses synchronized, slow and effortless, drawn into the garden's quiet rhythm. Gazing across the expanse, Liara traced the faint lines on Kaelin's forearm with a reverent touch. A subtle warmth unfurled beneath her fingertips, rising like the first glow of dawn over quiet waters, as though the light in his skin stirred in recognition of her touch. Kaelin turned his face toward Liara's hair, the soft floral scent of the garden clinging to her from a day spent among blossoms. The space between them deepened, their gestures deliberate as wind tracing patterns over a resting lake, her fingertips gliding over his arm, his pulse sinking to the quiet cadence of her touch. Liara's fingers mapped constellations across his skin, tracing him into memory like verses murmured through wind-stirred leaves. Kaelin's touch drifted, warmth passing between them like embers glowing in the twilight. His warmth tangled with hers, a silent vow dissolving into the hush of the night. In that moment, nothing else existed, only the steady cadence of their heartbeats, the garden stirring around them, and the unbreakable tether between two souls entwined beyond time. Only then did Kaelin gently break the silence. "Have you noticed," he murmured, "that the lilies by the lake opened earlier today?" Liara's dark eyes flickered with quiet amusement. "We must be caring for them too well," she teased, though her voice held a thread of wonder. "Or they've learned to trust us enough to share more of their light." Kaelin's lips curved into a soft smile. He ran a hand lightly along Liara's back. "They trust you, love," he said, his voice tender. "I simply follow your lead." Liara parted her lips, the words gathering like petals before they unfurled to the sun. But before sound could escape, the earth beneath them stirred, a shift so slight it might have been mistaken for the breath of something vast beneath the soil. A stillness too deep followed, not rest, but something poised at the edge of motion. Kaelin straightened, gaze drawn to the mountains. A thin fracture whispered through the stone, imperceptible at first, like a secret unraveling in the marrow of the land. And yet he could feel it, an echo of something distant, something unseen threading through the earth's quiet veins. He stepped forward, extending a hand to gauge the subtle life essence that once thrummed through stone and soil. Instead, a jagged, discordant vibration clashed against the gentle rhythms he knew so well. Liara felt it too. Her fingers curled slightly, as though seeking something to anchor her. She did not speak, but her grip found Kaelin's, fingers lacing together in silent resolve. They moved toward the garden's main glade, where something in the air felt expectant. Liara lowered herself beside the lake. Its surface, dark as unspoken thought, had begun to ripple, though no wind stirred the air. The water stretched outward in uneven rings, its mirrored surface bending the twin moons into fractured, wavering shapes. A whisper of movement slipped beneath the surface, vanishing before it could be grasped. Tendrils of mist curled from its edges, their scent acrid, sharp, a faint trace of something unnatural threading through the expanse. At Kaelin's approach, Liara rose, slow and deliberate, yet something in her poise wavered, as though she stood at the edge of an unseen current. Her hand found her chest, fingers pressing lightly over her heart, tracing the shape of something elusive. Kalen did not need to ask. Its presence brushed against him, a quiet dissonance settling into the weave of the garden, shifting something sacred out of place. Together they gazed at the gloom gathering at the threshold of this consecrated place, like thunderclouds massing at the horizon before a storm. "This realm is losing its song," Liara whispered, her voice scarcely more than a thread of sound. Caught between denial and the slow creep of dread, Kalen placed a steadying arm around her waist. The warmth of his touch steadied Liara. For an instant, their unspoken bond held back the creeping unease threading through the ether. Yet even as they held on to each other, the quiet rhythm that once sustained this realm frayed into unease. With each moment, the fracture deepened, a wound threading through stone and time, balance slipping toward an unseen brink, and even stillness carried the weight of something shifting. Kalen pressed his brow to Liara's. "We'll face it," he murmured, voice edged with quiet resolve. "Whatever this is." A shiver coursed through Liara. She lifted her gaze, steadied herself, and then nodded. "Together," she affirmed. "We always do." At dawn's threshold, Kalen and Liara approached the archway, their steps slowing, hesitation threading between them. Once, this place had been a beacon, a threshold of woven light and silk-threaded vines, its blossoms exhaling luminescence like whispered prayers. Now, as Kalen reached out, his fingers met the brittle, curling edges of a petal that crumbled at his touch. The arch sagged beneath the weight of creeping black filaments, its form bending as though something unseen pressed against it. The air carried the perfume of jasmine, rich as a lingering benediction, but as the scent reached Liara, a shiver traced her spine. The floral sweetness was marred by something fainter, a whisper of disharmony threading through it like a memory unraveling. She knelt beside a small cluster of orchids at the arch's base, pulse unsteady as she reached out. The petals, once translucent with an inner glow, now felt dry beneath her fingertips, their edges curling inward in retreat. The brittle stems shuddered at her touch, fragile as old parchment. She withdrew slightly, a tremor passing through her, the weight of the realms unraveling, pressing against her ribs. Kalen knelt beside her, his presence steady, though she could feel the quiet tension in the way his fingers drifted over her shoulder, a fleeting warmth dissolving into the air. She turned to him, searching his face for an answer neither of them held. "Let me sing to them," she whispered, though doubt coiled at the edges of her voice, twining with the hope she refused to release. Kalen met her gaze, hesitation flickering behind his resolve, but he nodded. Liara parted her lips, and at first, only silence lingered, hesitation curling in the space between thought and song. Then, soft as wind threading through withered leaves, her voice took shape, a lullaby older than memory, once strong enough to beckon blossoms into bloom. Slumber, O blossoms, in moonlight's embrace. Night hums a promise, so soft in its grace. Drift where the hush lets the old day depart. Dawn will return, lighting roots in your heart, whispering warmth in the cradle of dark. Life stirs anew in the seed of a spark. Slumber, O blossoms, and trust in the light. Soon you will waken, renewed by its might. At first the orchids quivered, their brittle leaves stirring, as if reaching for a light they could no longer recall. A shimmer ghosted along their edges, the faintest echo of vitality. Then, as though the effort was too great, the glow collapsed inward. The light wavered, curling away from her song like a breath held in hesitation. Liara's voice stilled. She lowered her hands, fingers trembling, grief tightening around her breath. Kalen touched her shoulder. "It's all right," he murmured. "We'll try again." But even as he spoke, the orchids stood unchanged, their silence an answer all its own. Liara steadied herself, a quiet resolve unfurling through her limbs, centering her before she rose. Beside her, Kalen's movements were deliberate, each step carrying the weight of something unseen. They moved through the garden, their silence woven with unspoken questions, their gazes tracing the fading light as they walked. At the celestial weave, Kalen's steps slowed. He reached out, fingers grazing the edge of a bridge once crystalline, now dulled. Beneath his touch, it pulsed faintly, its light struggling against the tendrils of shadow lacing through it. Liara followed his gaze. Where once the lattice of drifting aisles had shimmered like stardust, dark filaments now curled through their structure, unraveling the delicate threads that bound them together. Beyond the fractured aisles, the river of life stretched ahead, once a ribbon of light, now dulled to a sluggish drift, its current weighted by absence. Kalen knelt at the edge, fingertips grazing the water's surface. Where once it had shimmered with the clarity of starlight, now it resisted, thick and heavy, as if the memory of its own song was slipping away. They didn't need to speak the realization aloud. The unraveling was no longer creeping, it had taken root in the bones of the realm itself. Kalen's gaze flickered, drawn to the thinning light, to the spaces where air pressed too heavy, where movement frayed at the edges of sight. Not movement, not quite, more like the absence of something that should be there. A cold tremor unfurled through him, a chill untouched by the wind. He turned, a quiet stillness settling over him, eyes catching the faintest disturbance at the edge of his vision. The shadow bled through the slumped branches, winding between them before slipping behind the fallen vines. It never fully emerged, but its presence curled against his skin, a weight both cold and knowing, sinking deep into the marrow of the air itself. Drawn forward, they moved deeper into the glade. Where azaleas once bloomed in bursts of color, brittle stalks and ashen leaves crumbled beneath their touch. When Liara reached out to one of the skeletal branches, the wood splintered with the lightest pressure, breaking the silence with a fragile snap. She swallowed hard, fingers grazing the fractured branch as if tracing something long lost. "It feels like the past is rising," she murmured, "as if the garden is remembering everything we've tried to forget." Kalen steadied himself, his gaze drifting to the skeletal remains of the glade. "We planted this place with love," he said, his voice quiet, strained. "But maybe love isn't enough. Maybe the things we've feared have been growing right alongside it." With each cycle, the garden's breath grew shallow, its rhythm faltering beneath unseen hands. Buds clenched shut, vines slumped inward, retreating from a world unraveling. Liara hovered her hand over a patch of lilies, but before she could touch them, they withered, folding into darkness. Kalen stiffened beside her, gaze flicking to the trees. A shift, something deeper than shadow, something that did not merely move, but stretched thin across the air itself. The sensation of being watched clung to his skin, cold and insistent, but when he turned, the branches swayed as if nothing had passed. With every cycle, the signs became undeniable. The weight of the unseen pressed into every leaf, every root, filling the spaces between moments, between heartbeats. From the depths of the shadows, something stirred, pressing forward, slow and patient. Liara's gaze found Kalen's, fingers curling at her sides, as if bracing for the weight of what lingered beyond sight. It's coming. Twilight draped the garden in unease, half-light wavering, like breath caught between waking and dream. Kalen and Liara stood at the heart of the glade, encircled by the garden's last, unraveling threads of harmony. Their hands hovered inches apart, fingers ghosting toward one another, as ribbons of pale energy wove between them. Fragile filaments of light spun from a world refusing to kneel. Beneath them, a rhythm pulsed. They chanted as one, voices entwining like braided currents. The power they summoned flared bright, washing over the clearing in a rippling wave. For a fleeting heartbeat, the shadows writhed, peeling away from trembling blossoms as though scalded by the incantation's light. The darkness recoiled, twisting inward like ink drawn in reverse, unmade in the wake of light. Yet in that instant, the garden shimmered in stillness, as if clinging to the light, unwilling to let go. But then, no exhale, no relief. The hush did not lift. It thickened, folding into itself like a breath stretched too thin. Then came the whisper, a presence, delicate yet vast, stretched between heartbeats, threading through bone, through thought, through memory. Then, a crack. The fracture ran deeper than stone or wood, splintering through the marrow of the world, felt beyond sight. The air buckled, light twisted, retreating from the encroaching dark as something spilled forth. Shadow stretching, folding, learning how to be. Ink poured from unseen hands, folding, unfurling. Too fluid for a body, yet too deliberate for a formless thing. Something ancient stirred within the dark, born of neither flesh nor shadow. It gathered, silent, deliberate, spilling into form, seeping, stretching, taking shape, a shifting mask. Kalen's two wide eyes, Liara's parted lips, 100 faces glimpsed, stolen, lost before recognition could take hold. It did not wear a face, it became one. Each borrowed feature trembled, caught between grief, hunger, and mirth that did not belong to the living. Then the shifting ceased, and what remained did all three at once. It studied them through vacant hollows where eyes should be, testing which face would unsettle them more. Then it laughed. Though no breath shaped the sound, no throat gave it form. The air surrendered, the leaves stood motionless, and Kalen and Liara felt the laughter inside them, an echo of something that had never truly existed. Black tendrils slithered from its fingers, reaching for the blossoms. The moment they made contact, the flowers shriveled, their light devoured as though swallowed by an unseen maw. The garden shuddered, vines curling inward as if bracing against an unseen force. Ah, it mused, its voice a beat behind its mouth, as if the words had forgotten how to belong to it. Look how bravely the candle burns, its light devoured by the molten hush that once gave it form. It took a step, though its feet touched no ground. The earth cracked beneath it. You wish to banish me? The forsaken eidolon tilted its head. Tell me, little flames, where will you go when the darkness takes the sky? Kalen gritted his teeth. The weight against his mind pressed deeper than force or pressure, an ancient presence coiling through the hollows of his thoughts. The voice seeped inward, threading between belief and doubt. You are too late. The thought was not his. You will kneel before the end comes. Whether in defiance or surrender is the only choice you have left. A faint shimmer wove around him, a fragile aura flickering to life, but the eidolon only tilted its head, watching, waiting. Liara stepped forward, her frame taut, her stance unyielding. She raised her hands, energy coiling between her palms like the drawing of a bowstring. A surge of light pulsed outward, too quick, too sudden for the spirit to avoid. For a fleeting moment the darkness flinched, yet it did not fall, it only stilled, watching her with quiet fascination. Then it laughed again, a hollow, soundless thing, an absence pressing against the edges of their minds. Kalen's pulse faltered, his grip tightening. The lilies beneath his hand drooped, their glow dimming despite his efforts. A whisper in his thoughts. Could light truly drive away what had already taken root in the marrow of the land? Liara's gaze darkened, her stance unshaken. She had once traced the hidden runes with cautious fingers, whispering their names as if listening for a truth yet unrevealed. Now, as the spirit loomed before them, her fingers curled with quiet purpose, an unseen force gathering between them. There is no other path, she murmured, her eyes focused. Kalen felt it, a shift, a choice solidifying like stone, set in the foundation of something inevitable. The forsaken eidolon did not strike, it did not need to. And then, as if it had never been, it dissolved, unraveling into liquid shadow, tendrils of night curling into the unseen. Yet its absence weighed heavier than its presence. Kalen and Liara shared a glance. The river of life stretched ahead, its surface eerily motionless. The night hovered, the hush between them thick with something unspoken, something inevitable. They did not turn away, knowing it would find them before they found it. Yet the confrontation came sooner than expected. By the river's edge, where lotuses should have bloomed in floating clusters, the water lay black and depthless. Kalen sensed it first, a shift too subtle for sight but heavy in the marrow, an unspoken fracture in the garden's rhythm. Then, the mist bled from the shallows in coils of ashen gold, thick with an acrid bite, writhing as if alive. From its depths, the demon spirit emerged, its form denser, its darkness charged with a volatile hunger. Liara did not hesitate. She moved before Kalen could stop her, kneeling by the river and pressing her hands above the surface. The water responded, ribbons of liquid light rising like silver threads, twisting through the air in shimmering arcs. As she wove the spell, the river stirred, rippling from within as if woken from slumber. Threads of silver light wove beneath the surface, pulsing in rhythm with the unseen currents. The water quivered, drawn upward in delicate tendrils, tasting the air, sensing the weight of what was to come. The demon spirit loomed, its shifting form tense, its hollow gaze fixed on the rising light. Then, a rush of wind, cold as death. The darkness struck without warning, slamming into Liara's chest, sending her stumbling back. The water collapsed in a muted splash, its brilliance extinguished. Kalen lunged, catching her before she hit the ground. Her frame tensed, fingers tightening around his arm, a faint tremor running through her grip. The spirit did not advance, it only lingered, head tilting, watching, before dissolving once more, thinning into shadow. Kalen slipped an arm around Liara's waist, guiding her toward the shelter of a half-wilted willow. His steps were slow, deliberate, matching the unsteady rhythm of her own. Exhaustion wove through their limbs, the weight of what had passed settling deep. His fingers traced slow, deliberate circles against her palm, an unspoken tether to something steady, something real. He wanted to speak, but when he met her gaze, The words died on his tongue. Kaelin saw resolve in her eyes, fierce, unrelenting, a quiet vow, unspoken yet unmistakable. She would try again. Slowly, Liara rose, fingers ghosting over a cluster of half-bloomed lotuses, as if listening for something lost. Kaelin watched, his heart pounding with something between admiration and dread. This was no longer their garden. The roots still pulsed, the flowers still glowed, but the silence was no longer empty. It pressed inward, thick with a presence unseen. And when Kaelin closed his eyes, the dark did not greet him. A face waited, silent, watching, remembered only in fragments. And beneath it all, a certainty grew. The time for restraint was ending. All day the garden moved with a restless hush, its vines shifting, reaching, searching for something lost. Even the air wavered, caught between presence and retreat, bracing for what it could not stop. Ever since Liara first spoke of risking everything, Kaelin had sensed a quiet resolve settling over her like a veil. Every movement was measured, deliberate, as if committing the world to memory before it slipped from her grasp. Her gaze lingered too long on the wilting lotuses. Her fingers trailed reverently over the veins of fading leaves, and in the moments she thought he did not hear, she murmured half-formed incantations, her voice unraveling like the last traces of a forgotten spell. Beneath their feet, the earth whispered its first stirrings, faint, measured, like the pause before a wave unfurls. Drawn by an unspoken pull, they reached the cracked foothills of the mountain of the heavens, where fissures sprawled like black veins across ancient stone. The land here was uneasy, shifting beneath their feet as though recoiling from something unseen. The sky hung low, clouds stretched thin, their underbellies bruised with unnatural twilight. The atmosphere pressed heavy, charged with static, and each scent Kaelin caught carried something frayed at the edges of reality. Then it came. The demon spirit spilled forth like a wound unsealed, its presence seeping through the fractures of the world. Shadows pooled at its edges, shifting between substance and void. Space recoiled, warping as the garden strained against a presence it could not contain. And when it fixed its gaze on Liara, something in Kaelin's chest tightened to the point of breaking. She stepped forward before he could stop her. Light wreathed her frail form, a final reservoir drawn forth, shimmering in delicate gossamer threads. It rose from her skin like mist unspooling from water. The garden recoiled, vines curled inward, petals trembled, caught between bloom and surrender. Even the wind held still, poised on the threshold of something unseen. Kaelin wanted to believe, if only for a moment, that she could do this. Then the demon spirit moved. It drifted forward, unhurried, unfolding with a slow, deliberate inevitability. Its tendrils stretched forward, hunger given form, reaching for her with the weight of inevitability. Its tendrils met her light, and the fabric of reality wavered, stretching thin at the seams. The glow trembled, fraying at the edges, drawn into the void like silk unraveling in unseen hands. Liara, the name tore from him, raw and desperate, Kaelin's voice splintering under the weight of his fear. He moved, but the air around him thickened, his limbs dragging through the space as if submerged in unseen currents. Every step was an agony, a slow war between force and inertia. The demon spirit did not acknowledge him. It only drank deeper, pulling at the radiance of Liara, unspooling her into threads of luminous filaments. She turned, just enough for Kaelin to see her eyes. Luminous, steady, bearing a sorrow he could not stop. A soft glow curled at the edges of her form, fragile as dawn's first light, unraveling, dissolving into strands of radiant thread. She yielded to the tide of light and shadow, dissolving into something beyond form, beyond self. Liara's gaze found Kaelin, holding his. In that fleeting instant, everything else fell away. The trembling garden, the unraveling light, the pull of the abyss. There was only them. Something unspoken passed between them, vast and unbreakable, a promise, a farewell. Liara's lips barely moved, yet her voice wove through the chaos, unshaken. Not all endings are lost, my love. Find me where the river sings. Kaelin wanted to beg her to stay, to tear through the bindings of this world and pull her back to him. But he was too late. The demon spirit folded inward, enveloping her in a tide of ink-black shadow streaked with silver like storm-lit clouds. Her form vanished within it, swallowed in a single wrenching instant. The world did not break, it simply ceased. Silence fell, hollow, absolute. In that moment, a raw cry tore from Kaelin's throat, fractured and unbound, swallowed by the wind before it could take shape. Kaelin's mind reeled, his body refused to move, his chest tightened, every inhale jagged, raw, like swallowing glass. A heartbeat ago, she was here, her warmth pressing against the world, and now, nothing. Kaelin dropped to his knees, fingers sinking into the cold, unyielding earth. His symbiote flared in alarm, pulsing waves of adrenaline through his system, urging him to move, to fight, to do something. But there was nothing to fight, nothing to reach for, only absence. For a breath, the demon spirit hovered, its form shifting like ink dispersing in water, its shape writhing with something akin to satisfaction before it unraveled into the swirling gloom, dissipating like a sigh of extinguished breath. Kaelin clenched his fists until his nails pierced his palms, yet the pain did nothing to ground him. The routines of their life together flickered through his mind. The dawn lilies they tended, the rippling reflections they once shared in the pools, the stolen laughter beneath moon-draped canopies. He reached out blindly, half expecting to find her hand where it had always been, but there was only the cruel chill of empty air. A shuddering grief settled over him. The twilight around him had shifted, its usual glow swallowed by hues of deep mauve and endless black. He was alone, adrift in a world that suddenly felt too large and too hollow all at once. And then, a whisper, a ripple against the silence, too quiet to be real, not words, not quite, just a presence, an echo threading through the hush. Kaelin, his breath caught. He did not know if it was real, or if his longing had carved her voice from the silence itself. But it did not matter, it was enough. At last, his body surrendered. His consciousness slipped, drawing him down into a darkness of his own making, a place where echoes of her lingered, weaving through the stillness like the remnants of an unfinished song, where the last traces of Liara's love held him fast against the abyss. Kaelin's final memory of the garden was the weight of something unspoken, hovering for a heartbeat before sinking into the earth. One heartbeat, the world still trembled with Liara's warmth. The next, it exhaled her away, leaving only the echo of her presence. The weight of grief became too much, pressing him beneath its tide. And now, when he opened his eyes, there was no garden, no sky. Only an endless expanse remained. Mists shifting in gray and violet, drifting like the sighs of things long forgotten. Light flickered within them, brief, trembling pulses, like fireflies lost in an unseen current. There was no horizon, no ground beneath him, and yet he did not fall. The space around him was unmoored, without direction, yet beneath his feet he sensed something, not solid earth, but a presence, soft yet unyielding, like the memory of a place rather than the place itself. The atmosphere was dense, metallic on his tongue, laced with something old, something bitter, steeped in the weight of centuries of grief. Kalen drew in the weight of the air, half expecting the familiar fragrance of jasmine and moss, the gentle perfume of the garden, but there was only the cold scent of absence, and with that his heart remembered. Liara was gone. The truth came like a blade between ribs, silent, precise, undeniable. He stumbled forward, reaching out, for what he could not say. His voice cracked as he called her name into the shifting vastness. No answer came, not even an echo. And then the endless expanse stirred. Thin tendrils of mist coiled around his ankles, hesitant, uncertain, like unseen fingers testing the edges of something foreign. His symbiote along his spine shifted, a ripple of unease shivering through it. He did not flinch, but the weight of the place pressed against his skin, against his mind. It wasn't hostile, only curious. He lifted a foot, testing, and the tendrils withdrew like startled snakes, spiraling into the mist before fading. The hollow beyond did not simply exist, it stirred, shifting like breath drawn through unseen lips. It was alive in a way Kalen could not name, its presence brushing against him, aware, waiting. Time ceased to move in any way he recognized. He did not know how long he stood, suspended in this weightless limbo, before the first whisper of memory flickered before him. A shimmer of warmth, a fleeting presence. Liara's laughter, soft as wind chimes in the distance. He turned sharply, eyes scanning the ghostly shroud. For an instant, the garden rose from the mist, half-formed, fragile as a reflection over rippling water. Liara knelt by the lake, her fingers trailing through water that no longer existed, her smile lifting as she glanced over her shoulder at him. His breath caught, his hand lifted, instinctive, desperate. He reached for her. Gradually, the vision unraveled like silk caught in the wind, torn away before his fingers could graze its edges. The ache that followed was as deep as the ocean, as vast as the unraveled expanse itself. He did not know how long he wandered. The drifting haze stretched endless in every direction. Each time he stepped forward, it felt both like progress and futility, as if the hollow beyond itself was testing his resolve, pulling him deeper into itself with every movement. More memories emerged, weaving in and out of the mist. Liara laughing beneath the twilight canopy, her hands cradling a bloom of light. The warmth of her touch on his wrist, grounding him after a long day, her voice whispering his name in the hush of evening. Each memory was a dagger in silk, soft against his skin even as it cut, unraveling him thread by thread. He could not run from them, could not push them away. The echoing deep did not allow escape, it demanded acknowledgement. He paused. A tremor stirred within him, deep and unbidden, as clarity unfurled like a whispered truth slipping through the veil of the unseen. It did not confine him, it mirrored him, his grief, his longing, reshaped in drifting veils of shadow, his sorrow, his loss, reflected back at him in the formless expanse, shaped by the weight he carried. A shudder ran through him, the ache in his chest unraveling like threads loosened from a fraying weave. If he ran, it would follow. If he fought, it would resist. But if he let it in, if he listened, the thought was terrifying. And yet, what else remained? Kalen closed his eyes and did the one thing he had feared most. He let it in. Heavy and unrelenting, grief surged through him, pressing against his ribs like a tide breaching its walls. Sorrow shaped him, an ancient tide carving its path through the marrow of his being. And when the wave crested, he did not resist. He sank, and the hollow beyond answered. The mist thickened, wrapping around him in shifting threads, but this time he did not resist. He sank into it, not as surrender, but as understanding. And in that surrender, something within the unraveled expanse shifted. The hum that had vibrated beneath his skin since he arrived grew deeper, almost resonant, as though the place itself had exhaled in relief. A path took shape, sensed in the quiet pull of something unseen. The hollow beyond had been waiting, measuring the weight of him. A stillness lingered, stretching between one thought and the next, vast and unbroken. Kalen lifted his gaze. He did not know where the path led. He did not know if it would bring him closer to Liara or deeper into the unknown. But for the first time since she vanished, there was a direction, a purpose. He stepped forward, and the hollow beyond moved with him. A faint glow wavered in the distance, fragile as a dying lantern. Kalen barely noticed when his feet began to move, drawn by something deeper than thought, instinct or memory. The mists parted only slightly, shifting in sluggish swirls as though reluctant to allow passage. A deep thrumming stirred beneath his feet, resonating through his bones and awakening within, trembling through the marrow of his being, a resonance of sorrow spilling outward, brushing against the unseen. At last he arrived. Before him stood a phenomenon that defied logic, a living flame, suspended in the endless gray. It was fire unlike any he had known, unbound, unshaped, a presence unto itself. It did not consume. It existed moving with a will that was wholly its own. It flared high, curling into the form of a regal pillar, only to coil into itself, its edges flickering like a serpent poised to strike. Within its restless glow, something flickered, a shape, a whisper of familiarity, and then, for a breath that stole all others, he saw her, Liara. Her face surfaced from the ember-lit current, features sculpted from luminous tendrils of flame. The world tilted, his heart clenched, his pulse stilled. It was impossible, and yet the fire moved as if shaping her expression with aching precision. The embers shifting to match the soft curve of her lips, the luminous depth of her gaze. Kalen felt himself drawn forward, pulled by something deeper than hope, something more desperate than reason. Liara? The thought barely formed before his lips parted, a whisper threatening to escape. A surge of heat washed over him, both inviting and forbidding. The whispers unfurled, soft, elusive threads drifting through the air like unseen currents. Liara's laughter wove through them, fragile yet resonant, a melody stirring memories of dawn-lit gardens and twilight's embrace. The sound shimmered around him, threading through the marrow of his being. He swayed under the force of it, his entire being caught between wonder and anguish. His hand lifted, unthinking. If she was here, if this was truly Liara, his fingertips brushed the light, and the light burned him. Kalen recoiled with a sharp cry, cradling his hand against his chest. The searing pain left no scar upon his skin, but within, it carved deep. The flame hissed in return, sputtering violently, No longer Liara's face, but a chaotic swirl of orange and blue, shifting in frustration. This was beyond his grasp. His chest tightened, each inhale dragging through him like a frayed thread unraveling beneath unseen weight, his heart hammering in defiance of the truth settling within him. The fire flickered again, but this time it did not attempt to take form. It did not beckon him forward, nor did it retreat. Instead, it pulsed with an unseen awareness, shifting with the weight of something unspoken. Kalen pressed his burned hand against his chest, steadying himself. Why couldn't he let go? How could he not see her in everything? She was in the shimmer of the mist, the hush of unseen winds, the threads of memory entwined in the very air he moved through. Even now, standing before this lingering illusion, he longed to call her back. But the past is not a name that answers. Yet here he stood, unable to move beyond what was already gone. The flame flared once more, crackling in sharp bursts that sent ripples through the surrounding expanse. This was not an illusion meant to deceive. It was a challenge woven into the very fabric of the hollow beyond. If he refused to relinquish the past, he would burn himself with what could never be. His symbiote shuddered along his spine, pulsing with his conflict. The unraveled expanse would not let him pass unchanged. The weight of it settled deep, threading through his chest, quiet and inexorable. Kalen let the ache take shape within him, spreading slow through the hollow of his ribs. His hands, once clenched, opened. He closed his eyes. "If you are an echo of her," he whispered, "then I will not hold you. If you are not, then I will not hold what was never mine." The flame froze. For a single breath, all was still. Then it flickered, its glow shifting into something softer. The searing heat that had burned him only moments before dimmed into a muted warmth, no longer punishing, no longer beckoning. It hovered before him, spiraling in slow, deliberate motion, a silent acknowledgement, an ember waiting to be carried forward rather than clung to. Kalen opened his eyes. The fire was never Liara, yet in its glow she remained, steady, guiding, a presence without form. And then, as if her hand still lingered in his, he heard it. "One step forward, my love." Beyond the flame, the mist shifted, folding into itself, reshaping with quiet intent. A space that had once been untouched now carried the faintest glimmer of something yet unshaped. He did not know what lay ahead, nor what else the hollow beyond would ask of him before granting him release. But for the first time, he moved without weight, carried by the unseen. He glanced at the ember one last time. Softly he whispered, "Thank you," though the words faded into the echoing deep, like the last light slipping beyond the horizon. With quiet resolve, Kalen stepped forward. The ember followed, floating in his wake like a silent companion, casting its flickering glow into the endless expanse. The mist curled around them, and the path unfolded one step at a time. Kalen walked onward, the ember dimming behind him, its glow dissolving into the restless mist. Something within him had shifted, a tide retreating, reshaping the shore with each ebb. Grief moved through him, quiet and steady, but the depths no longer swallowed him whole. The hollow beyond had been silent, vast and watchful. But now, something stirred, not a voice, not a call. A breath, and then water, its murmur curling through the hush like a whispered invitation. At first, he thought it a trick, another echo of memory luring him deeper into its labyrinth of longing. But as he walked, the sound strengthened, evolving from a distant hum into the unmistakable melody of flowing water. It carried a quiet certainty, steady and unbroken, like a heartbeat pressed against the fabric of the world. The mist unraveled, revealing a river unlike any he had known. a ribbon of black glass, winding through the expanse, its surface reflecting only the endless depth of itself. Beneath the water, light drifted in liquid constellations, shifting like stars caught in a slow-breathing tide. A living constellation, blooming and fading in patterns beyond mortal knowing, as if the river carried the thoughts of those who had stepped into it before him. The ether around it carried a warmth unlike the fire's searing heat, gentle, like the lingering warmth of a presence that has only just slipped away. Kalen knelt at the water's edge. The river moved in measured cadence, unrushed, yet always flowing. Its current carried a quiet intent, steady and assured. He dipped his hands into its flow, expecting an icy chill. But the water embraced him with a surprising warmth. A resonance trembled through his skin, his bones, a low melodic hum that spoke to him. He closed his eyes, and in the void of his mind, he saw his own reflection ripple, breaking apart like scattered light. Then, beside his own, another reflection took shape. Liara. Kalen's pulse faltered. She wavered, insubstantial, a flickering imprint upon the water, as if the river itself held her memory in its currents. A ripple passed through her features, her gaze tender, luminous with sorrow. He reached for her, and then he hesitated. The memory of the flame lingered, how he had tried to hold on, how he had been burned for it. His fingers curled inward, pressing into his palm, a quiet act of restraint. The symbiote along his spine pulsed in tandem with his heartbeat, each pulse carrying the weight of something unspoken, an ache, a longing, a hesitation that coiled deep within his marrow. A tear slipped from his cheek, falling into the water. The moment it touched the surface, ripples expanded outward, sending ripples through Liara's reflection, unraveling it into a spiral of light. The river carried her image away, and Kalen watched in quiet reverence. Kalen let the moment settle, feeling the shift in his chest. The current lapped gently at his hands, a steady pulse mirroring the rhythm deep within his chest. It pulled and swayed, carrying more than water, something unspoken, lingering at the threshold of release. His fingers trembled, hovering between grasp and surrender. The river carried Liara's reflection forward, weaving it into light. Its flowing embrace did not take, did not erase, only carried, only let go. Kalen stepped in. The water welcomed him, warmth seeping into his bones. With each step, the river took something from him, gentle, patient, an unspoken release. His guilt, his regret, his desperate need to hold on to what was, all of it unwound from his soul, drawn into the flow. The water reached his chest, and he paused, his body half submerged. The reflection of Liara remained beside him, but it no longer felt separate. She was in the river, in the current, in the breath between each ripple. Kalen closed his eyes and let himself sink beneath the surface. The river cradled him, enveloped him, its hum resonating through every fiber of his being. It stripped him bare, not of memories, but of the pain woven too tightly around them. He surrendered to it, let it take the weight he had carried for so long, and as he drifted he understood. When he finally broke the surface, his chest heaved, his body trembling from more than the release. Water clung to him, shimmering like stardust as he waded back to the shore. The hollow beyond did not stir, did not speak, and yet, as he pressed a hand to his heart, feeling the steady rhythm there, he sensed a quiet knowing in the hush. Ahead, the mist thinned, revealing a path woven from soft luminescence, winding deeper into the unseen. The river had not answered his questions, had not granted him certainty, but it had carried him forward. Kalen stepped from the river's embrace, water slipping from his limbs like the remnants of a dream. The warmth did not fully leave him, yet the hush of the hollow beyond curled around his skin, pressing close, trembling on the edge of becoming. Something had shifted. Where absence once ached, a quiet resonance remained, woven into the marrow of his being. Liara was no longer just a memory. She was something deeper, an echo folded into the fabric of his existence. The mist had thinned. Ahead, an expanse of crystalline ground stretched out before him, smooth as polished glass, reflecting the shifting luminescence of an unseen sky. His footsteps echoed across the surface, the sound rippling outward as if the plane itself listened, as if it recognized him. Overhead, glimmers of ancient runes flickered in and out of existence, entire histories stitched into the very fabric of the cosmos. At the heart of the expanse, the wind ghost waited. Starlight wove through its shifting form, dissolving and reforming, an aurora adrift in an unseen tide. With every pulse, fragments of forgotten symbols flared and faded within its core, as if entire histories whispered through its ephemeral body. Glyphs flickered and reformed, remnants of languages long forgotten. Kalen did not need to grasp its purpose. He felt it. This was not merely a being, it was a keeper of echoes, a memory woven into the marrow of the world. A tremor passed through the crystal beneath his feet as the wind ghost turned toward him. The space between them vibrated, charged with a presence both solemn and inviting. As Kalen stepped forward, a pull resonated deep in his chest, an unspoken beckoning. The air thickened, humming with unseen forces, and then the wind ghost exhaled. A flood of images unfolded from its core. Liara's silhouette wavered into view, flickering like candlelight on the edge of oblivion. The demon spirit's ravenous maw followed, swallowing her in tendrils of ink-black shadow. Then came the mountain, fracturing, crumbling, its foundation undone by the slow hunger of time. And finally petals, thousands of them, drifting through the garden, weightless, silent, vanishing into the abyss. A jolt passed through Kalen's body. He had braced for another reckoning, but instead it simply showed him what had been. The wind ghost beckoned, its shifting form twisting in mesmerizing patterns. Kalen stepped forward, the crystalline plane steady beneath his feet, alive, aware. Then it rippled. A fracture splintered outward, shards of light scattered into the expanse, each holding a sliver of time. The brush of Liara's fingertips as they planted moonflowers, the shadowed maw of the demon spirit closing in, the barren wastelands of the scarred realm, stripped of life. His past unfurled, each fragment weaving itself into the marrow of his being. A silent truth pressed against his mind. His existence, Liara's existence, shaped by this distant, dying place. Vertigo overtook him. His knees threatened to buckle. He clenched his fists, willing himself to focus. The wind ghost twisted, and more reflections flickered into view. Liara tending blossoms at dawn, humming lullabies to the vines, dozing in the shade of a willow tree. Some raw, aching part of him longed to turn away, but he didn't. He forced himself to look, to absorb each memory fully. They were not mere echoes, they were proof. Liara had lived, their love had mattered. And as he studied the shifting images, he noticed something else. Thin, silken threads of light weaving through the fragments, converging at the wind ghost's core. A whisper drifted through his mind, a voice that was both Liara's and not. The ether stirred in response, carrying the echo forward. A truth whispered beyond the threshold. Every bond we forge lingers beyond time, threading through the spaces between worlds. It moved through him like a breath of starlight dissolving into water, sinking deep, settling where words could not reach. The wind ghost lingered, weightless and eternal, a seam where memory and presence intertwined. Kailan released a quiet sigh, and the space around him trembled in reply, listening, poised on the edge of revelation, urging him to understand what had always been true. Kailan felt it, something long held, finally unfurling within him. The forsaken eidolon, the fractured garden, the broken world, none of it negated the love he and Liara had shared. Grief had bound him, but it had never erased what was real. Love, memory, and devotion were not shadows of the past. They were echoes that endured. Stepping back, he felt the crystalline plane shift beneath him, a final acknowledgement of the transformation that had taken place. The wind ghost shimmered, its form unraveling slightly, dispersing threads of starlight into the air. Kailan sensed Liara's presence behind him, unseen but unmistakable, a warmth against his back, a hand that would always guide him forward. With quiet reverence, he bowed his head, a silent offering to the guardian of lost legends. No words were needed. With a final glance, he stepped forward, the path unfolding before him. The luminous fragments shimmered, drifting like dust adrift in moonlight. Kailan did not reach for them. He did not need to. They had already become part of him. A hush settled over the crystalline plain, vast and infinite. The swirling mists, the flickering runes in the sky, even the undercurrent of sorrow, all seemed to fold inward, as if the hollow beyond itself listened in solemn stillness. Kailan stood within the sacred stillness, his heartbeat a solitary echo in the vastness. The immensity around him no longer loomed as something to fear. Yet a final, unspoken barrier remained, woven deep into his marrow. His hands trembled. He had braced himself for grief, for longing, but what met him was neither loss nor absence. It was vast, luminous, and unfolding before him like the first breath of dawn. Liara's final words surfaced like a breath of wind in the depths of his mind. Not all endings are lost, my love. Find me where the river sings. The weight of them settled into his bones. She had surrendered completely, stepping into darkness without fear, embracing the dissolution of self for something greater. Could he do the same? Could he loosen the final threads, binding him to what was? Beneath his feet, the crystalline plain pulsed with a resonance deeper than sound, a vibration that wove through him like breath through silence. He closed his eyes. With each passing moment, something stirred, threading through his very being. It was something beyond voice, beyond name, yet it surrounded him, weaving through his very being. For a fleeting moment, Kailan tensed. If he yielded to it, would he dissolve entirely, become nothing, or become everything? But the presence did not demand. It simply was. A tremor passed through him, loosening the grip he had held for so long, allowing himself to feel without resistance. The tension that had bound him for so long unspooled, unraveling in a release so deep he scarcely recognized its absence. The crystalline plain shimmered, a great canvas of light unfurling beneath him, its surface shifting like a living tapestry. Deep ocean blues, untouched forest greens, golds as soft as dawn's first breath. Colors bled and swirled together, shaping something alive. The garden, the scarred realm, the fractured mountain, all of them were threads in the same vast weaving, pulsing with the rhythm of a single boundless heart. Existence stretched boundless before him, its vastness a quiet hymn, neither drowning nor demanding, only carrying him forward. The vastness of it pressed against him, its beauty almost unbearable. Images surfaced in his mind, the garden's quiet cycle, where leaves withered so new buds could bloom, where water rose only to return as nourishing rain. Even the stars, burning to their final ember, did not fade but wove themselves into the fabric of all things. And from the void, understanding took root, not as revelation, but as something that had always been, waiting to be seen. "Nothing is ever truly lost," he whispered, the words dissolving into the vastness. All that had been is woven anew, carried forward in quiet imprints, lingering in the spaces between memory and becoming. Silence unfolded around him, shimmering and sacred. The universe itself exhaled, the hush between heartbeats stretching into infinity. And yet, within this space, all movement ceased. Suspended in its embrace, Kalen's being stretched outward, carried within the boundless expanse. A cautious thought stirred within him. What if, in letting go, he became one with this great current of life? Fragile in the face of such immensity, he felt himself unravel, thread by thread, unspooling into the expanse, weightless and unwoven. If he let go, if he yielded to this great current of being, would anything remain of him at all? Then, like a ripple across still water, a memory surfaced. Liara's eyes in that final moment, steady, unwavering, full of trust. She had embraced her dissolution without fear, knowing that love did not die, only changed. Something within him steadied. His knees gave out, but the crystalline plane did not shatter beneath him. Instead, it held him, warm and unyielding, as though it had been waiting for this moment. A single tear slipped from his eye, catching the glow of the flickering runes above before vanishing into the surface below. He whispered Liara's name, not in mourning, but in reverence, an offering of everything she had been and everything she still was. A new sound rose from the silence, soft and distant. A song, woven from wind and water, from the breath of the cosmos itself. It was a song beyond grief or joy, a resonance woven from the place where sorrow and love intertwined. Kalen let the music settle into him, stirring something quiet, something whole. And then, for the first time since she had gone, he smiled. Soft, quiet, real. Light stirred beneath him, the crystalline plane no longer cold but luminous, responding, becoming. For so long he had thought Liara lost to him, but now the knowing was simply there, vast and unshakable. His gaze lifted, drawn beyond the veil of all he had known. Eternity unfolded, woven into all things, and then the words rose, unbidden, as if they had always been waiting for him to listen. Liara was never erased. She is transformed, her essence interwoven with the cosmos. As no river runs separate from the sea, so too does love persist, ever-changing, eternal. He exhaled, and the truth deepened within him, like roots sinking into fertile earth. Nothing is lost. Those we cherish, the moments we hold dear, do not vanish. They only shift form. He looked at his hands, once trembling with the desperate need to hold on to her. Now they were still, open in his lap, at rest, unbound, just being. Peace settled within him, quiet yet vast, dissolving the final knots of regret. Grief remained, but it no longer clung to him as weight. Instead, it had softened, becoming compassion, a deeper capacity to love, to remember without pain. He lifted his gaze, and the colors around him deepened, growing more vibrant, more luminous. The cosmic chorus shifted, as if in harmony with his breath. He could almost hear Liara's voice within it, a whisper folded into the rhythm of the universe, seamlessly woven into the infinite. The realization resonated through him like an unspoken hymn, an ancient truth he had always known, but only now understood. A wind curled through the vastness, Neither whisper nor command, only breath, only being, and Kalen, for the first time, did not resist. He rose. The crystalline plain gleamed beneath him, reflecting light and the stillness rooted in his chest. There were still paths to walk, still trials ahead, but he did not falter. His steps were steady, no longer weighted by hesitation. For the first time since Liara's sacrifice, he felt whole, not because he had reclaimed what was lost, but because nothing had ever been lost at all. A gentle wind stirred through the vastness, carrying his presence into the fabric of the unseen. He closed his eyes, listening to the hollow beyond, vast and full. He whispered once more, his voice carrying only quiet, unwavering gratitude. Eternal is the way. As the crystalline plain faded beneath his feet, Kalen's revelation lingered, a shimmer, an afterimage of a world newly seen. He expected to descend, to fall as he had before, but this time there was no sensation of weightlessness, no abrupt displacement. Instead, reality folded around him like silk, a seamless transition between the vast, interwoven cosmos and the familiar embrace of home. Then, a shift in the air, quiet but vast. Kalen stirred, and the garden exhaled, a pulse of quiet recognition. The scent of moonlit dew rose, a whisper of welcome. Beneath him, the moss cradled his form, warm, almost sentient. He lay still, listening. The hush was no longer an emptiness, no longer a space carved by morning. It was whole, tender, alive. It did not return. It had only been waiting to bloom anew. For a moment, he wondered if the hollow beyond had been a dream. Had he truly walked through the trials of memory, grief, and surrender, or had he merely drifted in the currents of his own mind? But the hum of his symbiote resonated in gentle affirmation, and his pulse carried a new certainty. Something within him had changed. The stars above shone clearer than before, no longer veiled by sorrow. Petals stirred, unfurling in hues that shimmered like nebulae, their edges traced with starlit silver. The garden, steady in its renewal, unburdened by loss, exhaled into being once more. Kalen sat up slowly, his muscles recalling the weight of the journey. The symbiote, now pulsed in harmony with his heartbeat. As he rose to his feet, stepping onto the stone path before him, a soft glow emanated from beneath each footstep, welcoming him, acknowledging him. Even the mountain of the heavens, fractured yet enduring, appeared changed. Its cracks, though still visible, no longer bore the look of festering wounds. Instead, they gleamed softly, like the quiet marks of something becoming whole. Kalen stood still, the air rich with the energy of a world slowly mending. The garden had not been remade by divine hands, nor had it turned away from its suffering. It was growing through it, as all things must. Yet even in this serenity, Kalen's thoughts drifted beyond these borders, to the scarred realm, to its barren plains and toxic skies. still battered by the storms of its own undoing. The realm had not magically healed. The marks of time and destruction did not vanish. They had become part of what it now was. And in the ceaseless flux of eternity, where forms dissolve and re-emerge beyond expectation, even the barren expanses were not beyond the reach of a mystery greater than renewal. He walked toward the reflective lake, where he and Liara had once shared morning reflections. Kneeling at the water's edge, he gazed upon its surface. The two moons above cast their silver radiance over the rippling currents. He expected only his own reflection, but there, in the shifting light, was something more. A shimmer, a trace of Liara's presence, interwoven with the moonbeams and water's movement. His throat tightened. Something deep within him stirred, heavy with quiet knowing. She was here, not as a form to grasp, not as an echo to chase, but as the very rhythm of the world itself. The wind carried her presence, feather-light, a hush of warmth woven into the night. I have never left my love. Tears pricked at the edges of his vision. He pressed his palm to the water, watching the ripples spiral outward, their glow expanding into the night. Love and loss are not opposites, he murmured. They are partners in the endless dance of creation and dissolution. A single lily by the water's edge bloomed under his gaze, its petals trembling, before releasing tiny sparks of light, rising to join the stars. Kalen smiled. He inhaled deeply, breathing in the floral scent, rich with the memory of Liara's laughter. The vow they had once shared, to protect this realm, to nurture life, had never been broken. It had only deepened. He closed his eyes and whispered a quiet prayer, gentle and steeped in gratitude. To the garden, to Liara, to the great unbroken cycle that wove all things together. The words gathered in his throat, heavy with reverence, shaped by the quiet magnitude of the moment. The garden does not cling to the falling leaf, nor does the moon mourn the passing of night. What is unseen is not absent. What is lost is not gone. A candle unlit is not without flame. Its fire merely waits for the breath of the wind. Step gently, for even in sorrow, the earth cradles your feet. Walk with trust, for the unseen paths are no less real than the ones you tread. In the hush between heartbeats, in the stillness between waves, listen. Liara is there, as is all that ever was. The leaves rustled in response, a soft, knowing murmur. Far off, the river flowed, carrying its song through the night. Then, a shift. The air changed, thickened. A presence stirred at the edge of perception. Kalen did not turn. A whisper, deep and reverberant, threaded through the stillness. And so, you walked the path. The words lingered, carried on a current unseen. But it was not the wind, not the leaves. It was something older, a voice that had once been a mockery of all things sacred, now carrying the weight of something softer, something that was neither sorrow nor peace, but something between. The forsaken eidolon unspooled, its form loosening, thread by thread, undone by something gentler than force. Kalen stood steady, presence unshaken. The shadows at the edge of his vision no longer clung with malice, no longer twisted with hunger. Where once the being had loomed, an embodiment of torment, a chorus of gnashing whispers, it now wavered, its edges thinning like mist at dawn. Kalen did not flinch. He did not brace for battle. He simply watched. The eidolon flickered. It did not resist. No struggle, no defiance. Only the quiet return to where it had always belonged. You chose to let go, my friend, and in doing so, you have found everything. The voice was quieter now, its presence barely holding. Not all endings are loss. The words shivered through the air, then faded like a distant echo. and then it was gone. Kalen closed his eyes. The moment settled, deep and whole. The night hummed around him, unhurried, unbound. Silence settled like a secret hymn, and with quiet grace he walked. The threshold stood before Kalen, an instant suspended between two worlds. The garden reached into the broken land, their edges entwining in quiet communion. They touched, yielding, murmuring their truths to one another. The final tendrils of luminous moss faded into the cracked, waiting earth. A wind stirred at his back, carrying the faint scent of moonlit blossoms. The garden neither held him nor urged him forward. It simply let him go. He stepped beyond the final veil of green, and the world shifted. The stillness of the garden flowed into the vast expanse, a wind laced with dust and quiet memory. Before him, the land stretched vast and patient, fractured stone and softened ruins, mountains with spines worn down by the slow turning of ages. The horizon braced itself, steeped in the weight of time, carrying the echoes of what had passed. Above, the sky burned pale gold, softer than twilight's embrace, carrying the hush of something remembered, something spent. At his side, a small pouch of seeds rested against his hip, their faint glow pulsing in quiet rhythm with his own heartbeat. Each one held a fragment of the garden's essence, imbued with the slow hum of change. They were not merely plants. They were echoes of something sacred, waiting to be remembered. Kalen knelt upon scorched earth, the soil dry, cracked, hollow with all it had lost, waiting for what might come. His symbiote along his spine pulsed in steady accord, sharpening his senses, attuning him to the unspoken hunger buried beneath the dust. He closed his eyes, drawing in the scent of the earth, rich and restless. In his vast mirror of consciousness, the garden unfolded. Mossy glades, shimmering petals, rivers that sang lullabies to the roots they nourished. He did not impose this vision upon the land. Instead, he offered it. Carefully, he pressed the first seed into the soil. His fingertips met the earth. The landscape quivered. The wind hovered in quiet expectancy. A warmth pulsed outward. Not a bloom, not yet, but the first stirrings of something long remembered. The land did not resist. It responded, as if loosening to what had always been within. All life deserves a chance to flourish. Kalen whispered a quiet chant, his voice threading through the stirring air. The dust stirred in slow, spiraling currents. It was something vaster, a warmth that did not fade, a breath that did not end. Kalen smiled, the moment quiet and whole. And so, the cycle turned, reshaping itself as it always had. One step, one seed, given. Kalen walked. With each step, a seed fell, offered to the waiting earth. Some he placed with careful intent, pressing them into shadows where the wind carried the scent of unseen water. Others he scattered freely, surrendering them to the land's quiet wisdom. Not all would take root, but some would, and that was enough. The sun dipped lower, spilling gold and amber across the fractured land. The hush of the broken realm felt different now, shifting, reshaping, already becoming something else. The air stirred again, laced with an unseen current, subtle, steady, inevitable. Kalen stood still, letting the moment settle into him, and that was how all things began. Thus, the cycle turned.